I am 77 years old. My name is Gerald Marsh. I almost didn't go that night. My daughter had ballet recital tickets for the same evening, and I had promised to go, and then the recital got moved, and a colleague called with 2 Tonight Show seats, and I said yes without thinking. I was sitting in the 6th row when Steven Seagal said what he said to Bruce Lee's face on live television. I was in the corridor outside the studio 20 minutes later when what happened happened. I have thought about that night almost every week for 50 years. I am telling you everything I saw.
Let me start with who was in that building, because it matters for everything that comes after. Bruce Lee, in 1972, was at the exact midpoint between who he had been and who he was about to become. Enter the Dragon hadn't been made yet, the version of him that the whole world would eventually know. The name on every poster, the face that every generation since has recognized instantly. That version was still assembling itself. But in the rooms that mattered, in gyms and dojos and the offices of people who understood what real martial arts ability looked like, Bruce Lee's name already meant something specific and serious. He had students who were champions. He had developed a system, Jeet Kune Do, that had changed how serious practitioners thought about training. He had spent years building something real, something that existed entirely independent of cameras and film sets, and the people who knew about it spoke about it the way people speak about things they have personally witnessed and cannot fully explain. Steven Seagal in 1972 was 20 years old. He had been training in Aikido since his teens, had studied in Japan, and had returned to the United States with a level of genuine technical skill and a level of ambition that substantially exceeded it. He had done some small film work, nothing significant yet, nothing that most people had seen, but he was working toward it, with the specific drive of a young man who has decided he is going to be famous, and has organized his entire personality around that decision. He was tall, physically imposing, and had enough real Aikido training behind him that he could perform the art credibly. He also had, and this is relevant to everything that happened, a tendency to talk about what he could do that was noticeably larger than what he had actually demonstrated to anyone. He had been booked on the show through a contact of his managers, someone who knew someone at the production, the standard daisy chain of the entertainment industry. The booking was for him to talk about Aikido, to demonstrate some techniques, to represent this style that most American television audiences hadn't seen explained clearly. Small booking, modest expectations, the kind of segment that fills 15 minutes of a talk show and does its job and is forgotten by the next week. What his manager had not told him, what nobody in his circle knew until the day of taping, was that the other guest that night was Bruce Lee. I found this out sitting in row 6 from the man next to me, who had been to the show before and knew how to read the energy in the building before the cameras rolled. He leaned over about 20 minutes before the start and said they had 2 martial arts guests tonight, that the segment producer had let it slip to one of the audience wranglers. He said the 2 names, and I remember thinking, well, that should make for an interesting hour. I had no idea what interesting was going to mean. The show started the way the show always started. Johnny's monologue, the orchestra, the specific warm energy of a live audience, settling into the rhythm of something they've been looking forward to. Johnny was in a good mood that night. You could feel it, the particular quality of looseness that a great talk show host has when the room is with him and he knows it. He introduced Steven first. Steven came out, and he looked the part. I'll say that. He was 20 years old, and built well, and he moved with a particular kind of deliberate physicality that people develop when they've spent years training their body to be noticed. He wore a dark shirt, simple, and he sat down with Johnny, and the conversation started the way those conversations start. Background, training history, what is Aikido, how does it work, what makes it different from other martial arts. He was good on camera, articulate about the technical aspects of the art, clear in explaining the principles, the use of an opponent's energy rather than direct force, the emphasis on redirecting rather than blocking. Johnny asked smart questions, and Steven answered them well, and the audience was engaged. In a different evening, this would have been a solid segment that everybody went home happy about. Then Johnny said the thing that changed everything. He said, "You know, speaking of martial arts and the different approaches different styles take, I have another guest tonight who has some very specific thoughts on that topic. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee." The curtain opened. The audience reacted the way audiences in 1972 reacted to Bruce Lee, which was with an immediacy and a warmth that was different from polite applause. The specific noise of people recognizing something they already knew they were going to like. He walked out, and he moved the way he always moved. No performance of it, just a man going from one point to another with absolute efficiency. And he shook Johnny's hand, and he sat down. He looked at Steven. Steven looked at him. I was in row 6 with a clear sightline to the couch, and what I saw on Steven Seagal's face in the first 3 seconds of Bruce Lee sitting down was something I've spent a long time trying to describe accurately. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hostility, not yet. It was something more like the expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting to be the most interesting person in it, and has just discovered that someone else arrived first, and that the room already understands the difference. Bruce nodded at him. Easy, simple, the greeting of one practitioner to another. Stephen nodded back. Tighter. Johnny leaned forward with the energy of a host who has just put two very specific people on the same stage and is genuinely curious what will happen, the kind of genuine curiosity that's different from manufactured television excitement. He said, "Now we have two very different approaches to martial arts on this couch tonight. Bruce, you've described your own philosophy as drawing from everything, using what works, discarding what doesn't. Stephen, you've spent years in a very specific tradition. I'm curious what each of you thinks about the other's approach." Bruce said, "Aikido is a serious art. The principles are real. Using an opponent's momentum rather than opposing it directly, that's something I've thought about a great deal, and there's genuine depth in it." Stephen nodded. "Still tight," Johnny said. "Stephen, what do you make of Bruce's approach? Jeet Kune Do, taking from every style, not belonging to any single tradition." Stephen said, "I think it's interesting as a philosophy, as a theory." He paused, just long enough for the pause to mean something. Whether it holds up against a system that's been developed and refined over 1,000 years of real application is a different question. The audience received this. A few murmurs. Bruce said, "That's fair. Any approach should be tested. I've tested mine." Stephen said, "Against real opposition or in training?" Bruce said, "Both." Stephen said, "In the same way a boxer tests his style against real opposition, an actual opponent who's actually trying to hurt you?" Bruce said, "My students have competed at the highest levels across multiple disciplines. Their results speak to what the training produces." Stephen said, "Your students." "Right, and you? How often do you personally compete? How often do you stand in front of someone who's trying to knock you out and prove what your style does?" The murmuring in the room was a little louder now, people registering that the conversation had developed an edge that wasn't there 3 minutes ago. Bruce said, "Competition is one way to test a thing. It isn't the only way." Stephen said, "It's the real way. Everything else is demonstration." And if you think that was where things got uncomfortable, what came out of his mouth about 60 seconds later made that exchange sound like a conversation about the weather. Johnny tried to redirect. He said, "I think what's interesting is that both of you are coming at this from very different traditions, and there's real value in." Stephen said, "Johnny, can I say something directly?" Johnny said, "Of course." Stephen turned to Bruce. He said, "I want to be clear about something. I have a lot of respect for what Bruce has built as a film presence. What he's done on screen is genuinely impressive, and it's brought a lot of attention to martial arts generally, which is a good thing. But I think we need to be honest about a distinction that's getting blurred here tonight." Bruce looked at him. Still, the complete stillness he had when something was arriving that required full attention. Stephen said, "You're an actor. You play a fighter on film. That's not the same thing as being a fighter. I've trained in Japan under masters who devoted their entire lives to this art. I've studied a system that has genuine combat roots, and I think the conversation we're having tonight is treating those two things as equivalent when they're not." The studio went quiet, the way a studio goes quiet when something has been said that everyone understood was real and meant rather than performed. Johnny's expression did the thing where he was simultaneously interested in what was happening and alarmed by what was happening, the specific expression of a host watching something develop that he's not sure yet whether to stop. Bruce said nothing for a moment. 400 people in that studio waiting. Then he said, "Before the first film, I had been teaching for 9 years. I have students who are professional champions across karate, judo, and boxing. The system I developed is based on direct contact training across multiple styles tested against real resistance. The films came after all of that, not instead of it." Stephen said, "Teaching isn't the same as doing." Bruce said, "You're right, teaching is harder." A wave from the audience. Not a huge reaction. A murmur of recognition, the sound of people hearing something land. Stephen felt it go against him, and did what a 20-year-old who is running on ambition and has said something too large in front of 400 people does, which is double down. He said, "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I'm making an honest point. The way the public understands martial arts right now is being shaped largely by films, and the person shaping it most is someone whose primary skill is making fighting look real on a screen. That's a different skill from actual fighting, and I think people deserve to understand the difference." Bruce looked at him. He said, "How would you like them to understand it?" Stephen said, "Put a real fighter in front of you. Not a training partner, not a student. A real fighter, full contact, no choreography. Let's see what the system does." The audience made a larger sound this time. Johnny was already reaching for his desk. the specific reach of a host preparing to call a commercial break, the emergency tool of live television. He said, "That's a fascinating conversation, and I want to continue it after a short break." The on-air light dropped, and Johnny Carson, who had spent 30 years keeping his stage from becoming something other than what he intended it to be, was off his desk and at the couch before the break transition finished. I was in row 6 watching his face. He spoke to Stephen first, low and fast, and whatever he said, Stephen's expression went through something complicated, a brief flash of defensiveness, and then something that settled on the surface as compliance, but underneath was clearly still moving. Then Johnny looked at Bruce. Bruce looked back at him with an expression I can only describe as very patient and very done with the conversation that had just happened. Johnny said something. Bruce said something. Johnny nodded. The production staff around the edges of the studio were moving with the specific urgency of crew members who can feel a segment heading somewhere they weren't prepared for. Fred de Cordova, the producer, appeared from the production area and came to the couch. I had been on the show once before, years earlier, and I recognized him because he had a very specific bearing, the bearing of a man who has seen everything that can happen on a live show and whose face has learned to communicate urgency without alarm. His face, right now, was communicating urgency. He spoke to both of them briefly. Stephen nodded. Bruce listened without nodding. The on-air light came back on. Johnny sat down behind his desk, adjusted his tie, and did what Johnny Carson always did, which was find the version of the moment that served the show rather than the one that burned it down. He said, "We were talking before the break about the different ways martial arts express themselves, the differences between systems and traditions. I want to come back to something Bruce said, which I thought was genuinely interesting, this idea that there are many ways to test a thing. Bruce, you were saying that competition is one test, but not the only test." He was giving Bruce the floor, the reset, the opportunity to take the conversation somewhere more manageable. Bruce said, "Yes. The real test is whether what you've trained produces results when conditions aren't controlled. When your opponent doesn't follow the patterns you've prepared for, when the situation requires you to do something you've never specifically practiced, that's the test that matters." Johnny said, "And you feel your training passes that test?" Bruce said, "I know it does." Stephen said, "How?" Bruce looked at him. Stephen said, "You say you know it does. How do you know? What's the evidence?" "Because from where I'm sitting, the evidence is films, which we've already established aren't the real thing, and students, which tells you what the system produces in other people, not what it produces in you specifically, when real pressure is applied." Bruce said very quietly, "What would satisfy you?" The room felt that question, the specific quality of it, not confrontational, genuine, asking what the standard was that would close the argument. Stephen said, "Show me." Johnny said, "Stephen." Stephen said, "No, I'm serious, right here, show me. We've been talking about it for 20 minutes. Stop talking about it. If what you do is what you say it is, the talking should be over by now. And here is the thing that the room didn't expect. Here is the thing that made the 6th row of the studio audience, which included me, collectively stop breathing." Bruce said, "All right." He said it the way he said everything else that night, at normal volume, without performance, like he was agreeing to pass the salt. Johnny stood up all the way, both hands on his desk. He said, "Nobody is doing anything on this stage." Bruce said, "I'm not doing anything on this stage, Johnny. You're right." He looked at Stephen. "There's a corridor behind the stage. If you want to see what the training produces, we can go there." Stephen looked at him. Whatever he had expected Bruce to say, and he had probably expected Bruce to deflect, to suggest they move on, to take the diplomatic path that a man trying to protect his public image would take, this wasn't it. He had been expecting the conversation to continue long enough for him to win it on points, and Bruce had just ended the conversation. He said, "Fine," Johnny said, in a voice that was barely holding together its professional composure. "Neither of you is going anywhere, because this is my show, and we have 7 more minutes of segment time, and I am asking you both as your host to remain seated." Neither of them was listening to Johnny. They both stood up. 400 people stood up with them, or something close to it. The instinct of a crowd that understands something is happening and wants to see it. The crew members at the edges of the studio were already moving. 2 security people from near the side entrance were moving faster. Stephen moved first, and what happened next is the part of that evening that I have described to maybe 5 people in 50 years, and that I am about to describe to you. He moved toward the corridor, toward the exit, and as he passed Bruce, he did something that nobody in that studio, I think including himself, expected him to do. He grabbed Bruce's arm. Not a full technique, Not a committed Aikido entry, just a hand, closing around Bruce's forearm. The kind of physical assertion that means I'm not done yet. The move of a young man who has run out of words and reached for the first thing available. What happened in the next 3 seconds is something I watched from the 6th row and have replayed in my memory more times than I can count. Bruce's arm was not where Steven's grip expected it to be. Not violently removed, not yanked away, just no longer available, the way a rope goes slack when you pull on it expecting tension. The grip closed on nothing, Steven's own pulling momentum carrying him slightly forward, and in that fraction of a second, Bruce's hand was at Steven's wrist, the lightest contact, redirecting the forward momentum that had come from Steven's own pull. And Steven Seagal, 20 years old, trained in Aikido, 200+ pounds and 6 feet 2 inches of committed physical intention, sat down on the floor of the Tonight Show stage. Not thrown, not slammed. Redirected, the way a river redirects, using the water's own energy, and the river ends up somewhere it didn't plan to go. Steven sat on the floor for about 3 seconds. The studio made a sound that I have never heard anywhere since. Not applause, not a gasp, something between them that doesn't have a clean name. The collective noise of 400 people watching something that has just revised their understanding of something they thought they understood. Security reached them. 2 crew members reached them. Johnny was off his desk and moving across the stage, calling both their names, trying to get between them. Steven stood up. He stood up fast, with the energy of a man whose pride has just been engaged at a level that overrides everything else, and he said something that the people nearest the stage heard and that I caught the edge of from row 6. He said, "That was a trick." Bruce said, "Come to the corridor." They went to the corridor. And I followed them. I did this the way I did the other thing, without planning it, because something in me understood that whatever was happening behind that stage entrance was not going to be reported accurately by anyone with a professional reason to manage the story. And I was a civilian, with no reason, except that I was there, and I wanted to know. The backstage corridor at NBC Burbank was narrow and concrete and fluorescently lit, the functional skeleton of a building that looked better from the front. There was a staging area off the main corridor, rubber-floored, large enough, the space where I had been told set pieces were stored between episodes. That's where they went. About 15 other people followed, crew members, a security guard, one other audience member who had made the same decision I made. We clustered at the entrance to the staging area and watched. Steven was already in a stance when I got there. The real stance, the wide base of a serious Aikido practitioner, hands ready, weight properly distributed. He looked like what he was, a trained martial artist who had been genuinely studying a serious discipline. Bruce stood across from him, dark jacket, still on, hands at his sides. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. Someone in the group said something about stopping this. Nobody moved to actually stop it. Steven came forward. He used the technique that forms the foundation of competitive Aikido entries, a reaching grab toward the wrist, designed to establish control and transition into a throw. The kind of move that, when it works, puts a person on the ground with authority. It did not work. Bruce's wrist was not there. The same quality as on the stage. No dramatic avoidance, no martial arts movie defense. Just a quiet absence, like the space where someone was standing a moment ago when you turned to look at them. And as Steven's committed entry found nothing, the touch came, 2 fingers at Steven's shoulder blade, applying a direction to momentum that was already going somewhere, and the geometry of it produced a result that the rubber floor recorded clearly. Steven went down. One knee, both hands, catching himself. The 15 people in that doorway said nothing. Steven was up almost immediately. This is what I want to say about him, because this story isn't fair to him if I don't say it. He was not the kind of person who stayed down. Whatever his faults that evening, and they were real, he had physical courage, and he had persistence, and he stood up from that floor faster than I would have, and came forward again. The second time was like the first. Different approach, same result. Committed, technically sound Aikido entry meeting a man who was simply not in the place the technique assumed he would be, and the follow-through producing a result that went in the wrong direction. He went down again, this time longer, 4 seconds, maybe 5, his breathing audible in the quiet of the staging area. He got up. He looked at Bruce. His face was doing something complicated that I watched carefully and that I still think about. The anger was still there, but it was competing with something else now. Something that was losing the competition. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He said, again. Everyone in that doorway said some version of no simultaneously. The security guard took a step forward. Bruce said, no. It was the first time he'd refused anything Steven had asked for that evening. Steven said, why? Bruce said, because the third time will be the same as the first 2. And you already have enough to think about. Stephen stood there. His chest was rising and falling. His jacket was dusty from the rubber floor. The specific posture of a man who has been proven wrong about something important and is still deciding what to do with that information. He said, "How are you doing that?" Bruce said, "You commit before you arrive. Every entry. By the time your body gets to me, everything about your approach has already told me exactly where you're going. I've moved before you finish deciding." Stephen said, "That's not possible at the speed I'm moving." Bruce said, "You've now been on the floor twice. What does the evidence suggest?" Stephen looked at the floor, then at his hands. The hands of a man who has trained seriously and knows what training produces and is encountering something that his training hasn't produced in him yet and may never. He said, "I read about the 1-inch punch." Bruce said, "The name makes it sound like a trick." Stephen said, "Show me." The security guard said, "They really needed to wrap this up." Bruce looked at Stephen for a moment. Then he said, "Put your hand up." Stephen raised his right hand, palm facing out, the same gesture that 400 people on that stage would not have seen because they were out in the studio wondering what was happening back here. Bruce raised his right fist to a position roughly 1 inch from Stephen's palm. Contact barely, knuckle to skin, no space to speak of. He hit. The sound came first, the specific sound that force makes when it travels through one body and into another rather than stopping at the surface. Stephen's feet left the rubber floor. Not much. Not the dramatic airborne moment that the uploaded script describes. Maybe an inch, maybe less. But they left it, and his body went back, not far, not into anything, just backward, one step that his feet had not chosen to take. He stood there for a moment looking at his hand. He said, "That was 1 inch." Bruce said, "Yes." Stephen said, "I didn't see the movement." Bruce said, "There wasn't much to see." The silence in the staging area had a quality I've thought about many times. Not the silence after violence, the silence after something has been demonstrated that can't be undemonstrated, the silence of understanding arriving in a space that was not expecting it. Stephen looked at Bruce for a long time. Then he said something that I did not expect to hear from the same person who had said what he'd said on that stage 40 minutes earlier. He said, "I owe you an apology." He said it simply, without preamble, without the kind of face-saving qualification that people usually attach to apologies that cost them something. He just said it. Bruce said, "You said what you believed." Stephen said, "I said what I needed people to believe about me," which isn't the same thing. That sentence landed in the staging area like something heavy set down gently. Bruce looked at him. He said, "How long have you been training?" Stephen said, 6 years. Bruce said, "You're good. The entries you threw were technically clean. The footwork is solid. You've learned real things from serious people, and it shows." Stephen said, "But." Bruce said, "No. But, it's a statement. You've built something real. What happened tonight isn't about whether what you've built is real. It's about whether you understand how much more real it has to become before you talk about it the way you talked about it tonight." Stephen said, "That's a kind way of telling me I was out of my depth." Bruce said, "It's an accurate way of telling you you're at the beginning. The beginning is a good place to be, if you know that's where you are." Fred de Cordova had arrived at the doorway behind us. I heard his voice, the specific tone of a producer who needs to close something out and go back to managing his show. He said, "Gentlemen, I need both of you to come back to the studio. We have 3 minutes of segment left and Johnny would like to finish professionally." Bruce nodded and turned toward the corridor. Stephen stood there for another moment. Then he picked up his jacket from where he'd dropped it on the floor and followed. I went back to my seat. Johnny handled the last 3 minutes with the skill that 30 years of live television produces, finding a frame for the evening that made it feel resolved rather than incomplete, asking both of them something about the future of martial arts that gave them both room to say something forward-looking and professional. Stephen said something about continuing to develop his understanding. He looked different from how he'd looked coming out of the curtain, not smaller, something harder to name, more like a person who has learned something difficult in the last 40 minutes and is still in the process of figuring out what to do with it. Bruce said something about how every encounter teaches you something if you're paying attention. He said it looking at the camera rather than at Johnny or Stephen, the same quality of addressing the lens directly that the uploaded script captures so well, the sense of a man talking to something larger than the room he's in. Johnny said something warm about the evening, and the cameras went to credits. I drove home that night, thinking about the staging area, about the 1 inch, about Stephen standing there looking at his hand, about what he said. I said what I needed people to believe about me. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else from that evening. He was 20 years old and he was trying to be something, and in the process of trying to be something, he said things that weren't true and got put on the floor twice by a man who didn't need to say anything. And the man who put him on the floor twice said, "You're at the beginning. The beginning is a good place to be if you know that's where you are." Bruce Lee died 8 months after that night. He was 32 years old. I was eating dinner when I heard the news on the radio, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without doing anything. I thought about the corridor, about the quiet of that staging area after the 1-inch demonstration, about the specific quality of patience Bruce had with Steven that evening, the patience of someone who has already done the work, required to know exactly where they stand, who has no need to prove it except when something specific requires it, and who, when something specific does require it, does it cleanly and efficiently, and then talks to the person they just demonstrated something to, as though what happened was simply data rather than victory. Steven Seagal went on to a significant film career, built substantially around martial arts and physical capability. His movies were popular. He became famous in the way he had been trying to become famous. I never found any record of him publicly addressing that evening on The Tonight Show. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe, and this is what I actually believe, it was a private thing that belonged to him and to the rubber floor of that staging area and to the 15 or so people who had been in that doorway. I was one of those 15. I was in row 6 before that, and in the corridor after that, and I saw the whole thing from beginning to end. Some nights you're where you're supposed to be. I almost missed this one because of a ballet recital that got rescheduled. I have never been more grateful for a rescheduled ballet recital in my life. That's the whole story. That's everything I saw.